Okay, welcome to week 16 of exposure, my weekly imperfect video as an exposure for my OCD perfectionism. And I am filming this one in a state of fairly intense distress because I just got some news that was extremely distressing to me. And this opens up a topic that I have not wanted to share here because this has fundamentally been about me sharing my personal life. But of course, my personal life does not exist distinct from the world at large, political and cultural events. And there is one topic that, it's just come up for me. Don't worry, it's a topic that relaxes everyone, that makes everyone feel at ease, which is the COVID vaccine. Yeah, I have no desire to share about this because it's such a polarizing thing. And this is not what I want my public or private life to be about. Not that I have much of a public life, if you look at the view count here. I find it much more rewarding, and it feels much more of a central calling to me to share my own experience, my own heart, my own fears, my OCD, my relationship. To share on a topic that essentially affects everyone in the world. First of all, it feels like, why me? Why should I be sharing about this? But I guess the reason I'm going to share about this is because I'm one of the 8 billion people who are affected about this, and because I have a view that I dare say might surprise people who know me. So let's talk about it. I was vaccinated for COVID, and I was avidly vaccinated. I got vaccinated the day I was eligible. In fact, I drove 3 hours to get to a vaccination site that had availability, so I could get vaccinated the very first day. I was so eager to just go back to regular life. And after the initial series, I got the Pfizer after the initial series of 2 doses. When I was eligible for a booster, I got that. I think maybe not the day, but certainly the week I was eligible for it. And I viewed the whole controversy over vaccines as as ridiculous for a few reasons. First of all, every medical professional I knew was getting vaccinated. They presumably knew better. Every epidemiologist, every virologist I'd heard from, and of course now I realize the ones I'd heard from were the ones who were essentially palatable to the mainstream. But people who clearly seemed to have integrity. It would be one thing. I would have given more credence to vaccine hesitancy and concerns if it was authority figures saying you should do this. But it was authority figures and experts saying you should do this, and I'm doing it. So, these were people putting their money where their mouth is, putting their health in the same place they were telling us to put our health in. So it seemed, not only did it seem credible, it seemed incredible. It seemed ridiculous to assume that all these armchair diagnosticians and physicians knew better. It seemed incredibly arrogant, in fact. The anti-vax sentiment, that was the thing. It actually angered me. How arrogant can you be? If the experts are, again, not only recommending this, but doing this themselves, I think we can be pretty sure they know what they're talking about better than you do. And when I first, as I started getting closer with my current partner, Anna, it became obvious that she had a somewhat different view on this. A view, I think, informed largely by the fact that she's Greek. And there is I would say, if not universal, a very widespread distrust and mistrust of established institutions in Greece, largely due to the Greek financial crisis, where essentially the IMF orchestrated this bailout with these very draconian terms that have destroyed the Greek economy and continue to be felt years and years later. And in fact, in a sense, if it weren't for that, I don't think Anna and I would be together, because if it wasn't for that, if it wasn't for the devastation wrought on the Greek economy by the IMF and maybe other international bodies, she wouldn't have come to this country. Also, more specifically, we wouldn't be together were it not for the vaccine, because this was a major source of contention between her and her former partner. And while there were deeper issues that were revealed by this was sort of the impetus that broke their relationship up. Anna was vaccinated, but very reluctantly, and only because she had to be in order for her immigration status. And so this came up in our relationship, and I put forth my view that, like, just again, arrogance. I think arrogance is something that I find uniquely upsetting. And I have a lot of jokes, and not jokes, a lot of material about this, about the arrogance of physicists who don't understand time. And I just feel like one of my favorite quotes, and I don't know who it's attributed to, but this quote is, "Remember this, you could be wrong." The certitude of people, that's what I find so infuriating. Yet now, looking back, I realize I evinced that same certainty. And again, the uncertainty was based on a fairly, I think, understandable cognitive heuristic I engaged in. The experts are not only telling us to do this, they're doing this themselves. So, plus the science, trust the science. The science at that point when I was first vaccinated was pretty unambiguous. The vaccine seemed to confer near perfect protection from infection, and initially it was thought, well, obviously if you don't get infected, you can't have severe disease and death. So, yeah, I'm not enjoying talking about this. Anyway, this was a source of tension between Anna and I. Not that she held, not so much that she held a different view, a view of inherent skepticism about this, but again, the fact that it seemed to me that view was arrogant. But gradually, well, let's talk about trust the science. So the science has clearly changed. The science has changed from this prevents infection to, I remember when it was like July of 21, when there was this, I remember very clearly, there was this huge outbreak among a vaccinated population in Provincetown, Cape Cod, a place I love, where, and it sort of calls into question the idea that the vaccine confers essentially immunity. And from there, the story has continued to fall apart. There was a study about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, from Cleveland Clinic, an unimpeachable source, where they were looking at the efficacy of the booster. And they were clearly approaching it from a fairly, a mainstream approach. They assumed the booster would be very effective. But what they found was shocking. What they found was, the booster was moderately effective. I believe it was about a 30% risk of a 30% reduction in risk of infection for roughly 6 weeks after getting the booster. Not hugely robust, but some protection. But then this study found something to me that was shocking. It found that after this initial 6 or 8 week period, people who were boosted were more likely to get COVID than people who weren't. In fact, this study found a basically linear, I believe, association or inverse correlation between number of vaccine doses and risk of infection. That is, the more doses someone got, the more likely they were to get COVID. And if you read the entire study, and I did read the entire study very carefully, the authors themselves were very clearly shocked by this. And they offered all these alternative explanations. But I think because they're good scientists and honest scientists, they methodically went through and found that none of them could hold water. They could not find a single alternative explanation for why people who got more vaccine doses were more likely to get COVID, other than some sort of likely causative effect, that the booster was actually increasing the risk of getting COVID. Again, this was shocking to me. But what was more shocking to me was what happened next, or more accurately, what didn't happen next. I expected this finding to get mainstream media attention. See, this is part of my skepticism of conspiracies in general, is I feel like, you know what, I'm going to put that aside. I'll get to that in a moment, maybe. But I expected this to get mainstream media attention because, so far as I can tell, the New York Times, the media source I, up to that point, trusted the most, they have no ulterior motives. They have no reason to not report the truth. Yes, I am aware that they get money from pharmaceutical companies, but I also believe they have editorial independence, at least some degree of that. I mean, I've certainly seen the New York Times, and I've admired the New York Times for taking on a lot of very powerful industries and individuals. So I thought this very counterintuitive finding that the more doses you get, the more likely you are to get COVID, would be front page news on the New York Times. And I told Anna this. I was like, I don't know what to make of this finding, but I'm glad it's out there because now I'm concerned about this and it's clearly going to get mainstream attention and people are going to delve into this more and figure out what's going on. But that did not happen, needless to say. I gave up searching using the New York Times search function after about a month. After about a month of near daily searches for Cleveland Clinic COVID vaccine, no results. I realized they just weren't going to cover this study. In fact, the only mainstream media coverage I found for this study were people debunking it, but I read that carefully too, and the debunking was not at all compelling. The debunking wasn't even the debunking, it was just citing the author's article saying basically like, we don't really know what this finding is about. Not one alternative explanation for this was offered that I found. In hindsight, this was sort of the first thing that really made me question my own certainty about this. This very much played into Anna's narrative that no, you can't necessarily trust mainstream media and institutions. And now as I hear myself say this, I feel very naive for ever believing that. But yeah, I was still certainly, so I was open to the fact that, okay, these vaccines don't seem to be particularly helpful. But the idea they could be actively harmful, again, I was still very resistant to that because why would all of these experts have gotten vaccinated? But yeah, once that door was opened, I'm an extraordinarily curious person. I love novelty, I love exploration. And in this, there was that exploration sort of impulse combined with this sort of horror about what's going on here. Have I harmed my own health? Though again, at that point, I wasn't really thinking that, but as I started looking more carefully, I found more and more disturbing things. I won't get into all of that here, but all right, I guess I'll get to the broad outlines of it. Well, let me just get to the evidence, and then I'll state what I believe. But let me first state what I don't believe. I don't believe there's any conspiracy at work here. And I generally reject the idea of conspiracies because they require something that I don't believe humans are capable of, which is widespread coordination of large numbers of people with disparate interests without one person fucking up. If there was some sort of orchestrated conspiracy, i.e., if, let's say, a lot of people knew the vaccines weren't effective, but they were trying to lie about it, I feel like someone would have slipped up. Someone in the CDC, someone from Pfizer, someone would have slipped up. And not only would they have slipped up in this day and age where people have podcasts, like someone would have actually come forth as a whistleblower and gotten a huge book deal. So I don't believe there's any concerted conspiracy behind this. I think really it's attributable to pharmaceutical companies want to make profits, so they're going to put stuff out as quickly as they can. Public health officials, they were under a tremendous amount of pressure to approve something that could, allow us to return to normal. I think it's very inexplicable. Very explicable without resorting to believing in any sort of nefarious conspiracies that a medical product was pushed out under great pressure, great time pressure, great political pressure, great economic pressure that turned out to be problematic. But let's talk about how problematic it is. So the most concerning data is the data on excess deaths. I was following this very closely and I stopped at a certain point, and I'll get to why I stopped, but suffice to say, it's very distressing. So excess deaths refers to deaths from all causes. Obviously elevated during COVID, presumably due to COVID, but has continued to be very, very elevated since then. And you'd actually expect the opposite to be true, meaning after a pandemic, when everyone is protected from vaccination or prior infection, and very, very few people are dying of COVID at this point, you'd expect excess deaths to actually be lower than they historically are. Why? Because a lot of people died from COVID who would have been dying now and next year. But you're not seeing lower excess deaths. You're seeing very, very elevated excess deaths. And yeah. Oh, man. Yeah, this stuff is fucking terrifying. One of the most concerning studies. All right, let me just go there. So very elevated excess deaths. The thing I find most terrifying and most concerning is that there has been no real investigation of this. This is what I'm saying about excess deaths is not controversial. This is, I mean, if you think about it, if someone is alive or dead, that is a binary measurement. You can pull up these statistics. And there's been a lot of press about this in other countries, particularly the UK. There's been very, very little press about this in the US. In fact, I dare say people watching this, if they're in the US, they might actually question, wait, is that really true about excess deaths? But it is. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'll link some stuff in the comments. I don't want to have the sort of videos where it's like links to sources in the comments. I want to be fucking talking about my relationship and my family and hiking and comedy. But anyway, yeah, a huge, huge, huge increase in excess deaths in the US in basically every country. And no one fucking knows why, and no one is looking into this. And the fact that no one is looking into this is, to me, damning. Damning. I mean, so what are the absolute numbers? I don't actually know what the numbers are for the US, but I know like in the UK last year, it's something like 50,000 excess deaths. Much bigger population in the US. Yeah, I wish I knew the absolute numbers. I knew them at some point, but we're clearly talking in the hundreds of thousands of excess deaths. That is, hundreds of thousands of people more are dying now, and there's no fucking investigation of it. In the UK, where it has, again, gotten a lot of mainstream press, the official narrative is, oh, well, what's happened is, there's been a few narratives. One of them is that, well, people with, serious conditions weren't getting routine treatment during the COVID lockdown because they were afraid to go to hospitals, so now they're dying at higher rates. That was one explanation. Another explanation is that people put off routine medical care. Now everyone's going for routine medical care, so the National Health Service in the UK, they're overwhelmed, there's longer waiting lists, they can't treat people effectively, so that's why people are dying. And it seems plausible, but there's no, this is, by the way, this is an easy, well, it seems plausible, but there's no evidence for it, but that's been the narrative. But this is called into question by a recent study that found something extraordinarily concerning. It found that so researchers who want to study this, they kind of have to find these backdoor, very clever ways because the official health organizations are not studying this. So, I mean, here's the first thing to say. Yeah, you can see how upset I'm getting about this. And I think part of why I'm getting upset are the implications for my health and my loved ones' health. But I think part of why I'm getting upset is it's just, it's just fucking insane. What is insane? Here's the most fucking insane thing. 5.8 billion people got an experimental vaccine. Trust the science. That's why I got it. I was trusting the science. Well, the most basic, fundamental science we can do at this point is some sort of follow-up. Some sort of follow-up. How are these 5.8 billion people faring? And here's the most basic follow-up. The most basic follow-up we could do is look at deaths versus vaccine status worldwide. Extremely easy to do. I could hire a temp off Upwork for $20 an hour to do this in an Excel spreadsheet. This is the data I want to see. I want to see column 1, some sort of identifier, name or number if we have to anonymize it. Column 2, did they get a vaccine or not? Column 3, are they alive or dead? Is there a correlation there? Are people who are vaccinated dying at higher rates than people who aren't vaccinated? Spoiler alert, every piece of indirect data I have seen suggests yes. Here's one piece of indirect data. So, because again, they were only working with indirect data because the health agencies aren't disclosing this stuff, supposedly because of HIPAA, whatever bullshit it is. I mean, yeah, here's one piece of indirect data. A very clever study that just looked at a couple of very simple pieces of data. It looked at vaccine uptake at the country level. So in the US, I don't know what the number is, 78%, let's say. Similar, a lot of Western European countries, I think generally falling in like the 70 to 80% of the population got vaccinated against COVID. But there were some countries where it's very, very low. Bulgaria, I believe, don't quote me on that, is maybe 20%. Certainly African nations, a lot of African nations, very, very low vaccine uptake. And so what this study did is it looked at two numbers, rate of vaccine uptake at the country level and rate of excess deaths. And it found a perfect, mathematically beautiful, pristine correlation. The higher the percentage of a population getting vaccinated for COVID, the higher that country's excess deaths. Let that sink in for a moment. This completely undercuts the NHS, the UK health body's explanation, because why would people in the UK be more likely to delay medical care from a lockdown versus Africa? Now again, correlation doesn't equal causation. There could be a third factor at play, but I have not heard anyone advance a hypothesis what that factor may be. And again, the biggest thing that I am fucking irate about is this is very, very easy to study. Very, very easy to study. Here in the US, the CDC could do this study again in a day. Vaccinated? Someone vaccinated? Yes or no? Are they alive or dead? Is there a correlation? And the fact that this isn't being done, to me, what does that mean? It means, whatever it means is terrifying. Well, one possibility, of course, is that this data is being compiled but not being released, and it presumably because what it shows is concerning. Or two, it's just this head in the sand phenomena where we're just not going to look at the data. But I fucking trusted the science. I fucking got the vaccine. I want to see this data. So I've grown increasingly concerned about this. And there's other studies. The UK, there has been some data released that is strongly suggestive of the fact that people who are vaccinated are dying at much higher rates than people who are not vaccinated of all causes. Let me also take a step back here and say the vaccine certainly was effective at reducing severe disease and death. And so it's possible, there's a case to be made that even if the vaccine is causing these excess deaths, maybe it did more harm than good. Let me be clear. My position is not that the vaccine is bad. My position is simply that, like any other medical product, it's plausible that there are negative effects. And given the experimental nature and the unprecedented scale at which it was disseminated, we should just be doing some basic follow-up to see what these effects are. And if there are negative effects, that, again, it may mean that those negative effects are, it's unfortunate that it hurts some people, but it saves more people. That's very much a possibility. What I'm furious about is that it's not being studied. And so as this picture became clearer to me, I'll just throw out a few other pieces of data. There's no reason to get a booster at this point. So, this whole thing about people saying, I don't need to get vaccinated, I have natural immunity. Those people who I looked at as they're so arrogant a couple of years ago, they were right. There was an Israeli study that showed previous infection with COVID was, I believe, 26 times more effective at preventing severe disease and death than vaccination. And there have been other studies too. There's no question. Prior infection is far more effective than vaccination. And if you're hearing this for the first time, ask yourself why. I don't have an answer. Why is this not being disseminated? But also, vaccination is also very effective against severe disease and death, not as effective as prior infection. So the point is, if you've been vaccinated, there's an argument if you haven't been vaccinated and haven't had COVID, maybe you should get vaccinated, even if there are harms. But if you've already been vaccinated, and particularly if you've already had COVID, the evidence, again, shows that the vaccine further boosters offer no benefit and actually may increase the risk of getting COVID, and increasingly suggestive may increase the risk of death significantly. So I put all of this in an email to my family. And I spent, God damn it, if I put the amount of time I put into this email into my career, I would have more than whatever number of viewers I have for this. I mean, this was like a full-time job for a couple of weeks, really delving into the science, going deep. And this was not enjoyable work for me because this is very triggering. This is very triggering. The thought, again, that I may have harmed myself and that my family members may have harmed themselves. But I really went into it. And I mean, I obsessed over this email. That's the right word for it. I obsessed over it because I love these people. And by family, I sent this to my parents, my sister and brother-in-law, my brother and sister-in-law. And my greatest concern is for the kids, because this pattern of excess deaths is not evenly distributed. Generally speaking, it seems the younger the population, the higher the increase in excess deaths. Also, the younger the population, the less risk there is from COVID anyway. I mean, looking back now, there was never a case for kids to be vaccinated against COVID. And indeed, other countries, Sweden, I think, didn't do it. The data seems pretty clear that kids do not die from COVID unless if they have, pretty severe pre-existing conditions. So the idea that millions and millions of kids got an experimental medical treatment, and among those millions of kids are my very, 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 very beloved nephews and nieces. And so I obsessed over this email, laying out the case very, very carefully, and not being alarmist. The case was simply this, that the prudent thing is to not get boosters, given that the booster really seems to offer no benefit whatsoever, no increased reduction in getting COVID beyond a few weeks, and then an increased risk of getting COVID, no benefit in reduced risk of severe disease and death, particularly if you've already been vaccinated and had COVID, and this big question mark of all these excess deaths correlating with vaccine uptake. It seemed very clear that the responsible thing to do is not get more boosters. And I sent this email after, it was just a huge amount of time being put into this, and I did not get a single response. And maybe a part of me was glad about that. I didn't want this to create tension in the family. But I really, really, I guess I have to say now naively thought like, all right, I'm not advancing an extremist position. Hopefully they'll see this and say like, all right, we'll hold off on boosters. But again, the fact that no one responded was probably my clue. The only person I've talked with this about is my mother. We've had a number of conversations about this. She's an extremely intelligent woman. And and she expressed skepticism. And I get it. And part of this skepticism has been, let me address one other thing. Why is the FDA recommending these boosters if everything I'm saying is true? And I have no fucking idea. What I can tell you is the FDA is the only governmental agency in the world recommending, that I know, maybe China, I'm not sure, but no other European countries are recommending they're recommending the booster for all ages, I believe 6 months plus. No other European country, no other first or third world country is doing that. The UK, which again was very, very pro-vaccine, I believe there it's only 65 plus. A lot of other countries are only recommending the booster for people who have not previously had the vaccine, or recommending a primary vaccine series. But that was my mother's, one of her questions is, well, why is the CDC recommending this? And I don't know. And if you want to follow that rabbit hole, it can lead to some pretty terrifying places, but also some pretty speculative places. So I don't know, and I don't really go down that road. But we had a number of conversations, and basically I said, promise me that you're not going to get the vaccine or the booster. Promise me you're not going to get boosted. Or no, what I said is, if you're going to do it, promise me you'll tell me first. Promise me you'll tell me first. And in these conversations with my mother, I should say I did get emotional. And I know that's not ideal, and maybe that hurt my case. Anyway, we were talking, my mom and I were talking yesterday, and somehow it came up, and I said, you haven't gotten the booster, have you? And she said, no. And then she called me a couple of hours ago and said, I'm sorry I lied. Dad and I got the booster. And I lost it. My throat is hoarse. I was screaming at her over the phone. I was enraged because I'm terrified. And I've just been distraught since then. Distraught. And of course, I'm sure my nephews and nieces got another booster, and it's just so fucking stupid. What I was screaming at my mom is, do you think I'm lying? Do you not believe these studies? This email had all these citations in it. Do you not believe these studies? Because there's two options. Either you don't believe these studies, some of which are from, very well-known places like the Cleveland Clinic. These studies showing, again, no benefit from the booster, particularly no benefit if you've had COVID before or already have been vaccinated, and showing a rock-solid correlation between excess deaths and vaccine uptake. Do you not believe these studies? And she didn't have an answer, and I just, So I'm feeling shitty now, one, because I lost it on her. In a way, I don't think I've gotten this angry in years. And of course I got that angry because I'm that afraid. But also because it's like, fuck, I have to deal with this now. I have to fucking deal. So for a while, I've been thinking about talking about this, posting videos about this. And I don't want this. This isn't my brand. This isn't my fight, but I guess it is my fight. I mean, I guess it's, yeah. And again, my position fundamentally is not the vaccine is bad. It's like, trust the science. Let's do the most basic fucking science of doing some follow-up on the 5.8 billion people, including yours truly, who got this experimental medical product. And part of what I don't want to grapple with are the implications of this. I still don't necessarily subscribe to conspiracy theories, but God, it's almost worse if you don't. The alternative explanation is just this sort of collective societal inertia. That people were like, oh, we should get vaccinated, and now just, yeah, I guess just the stupidity. No, that's not the right word. It's not stupidity. It's just, if I had to guess, I think this is why I don't even know if they read the email. My family members. I know my mother did, but the others, I don't know if they read it. And I think probably why they didn't read it is the same reason I didn't want to engage with this when Anna brought this to my attention, because it's scary. And it's very easy to dismiss. It's very easy to dismiss to say, well, why would the CDC be recommending this? Again, the exact arguments I used with Anna, I could see my family members and anyone watching this using this with me. Like, I don't want this to be true. I want to live in a world where I can trust institutions. I want to live in a world where I've not done something that may irreparably harm my health, and my loved ones have done things that may irreparably harm their health. So, yeah, in some ways it feels like some sort of loss of innocence, which feels ridiculous for someone who's almost 50. So I don't know what my move is now. I think I'm going to bring it up again with the family. But yeah, it feels like a schism with them, and also like just, yeah, they're all more mainstream people than I am, but my attitude toward the vaccine was very mainstream, but it's just, what do I want? Yeah, I mean, at an emotional level, I want to be like, oh, we were wrong. The same thing I think Anna wanted, probably for me, but she didn't. Really what she wanted when we had these conversations was to convince me not to get more boosters, and she did accomplish that. Or I accomplished that as I looked into the data more. And I told my mother, I was like, I'm cutting you out of my life. I mean, I was saying horrible, horrible things to her. And she obviously has a difficult life with my father and his Alzheimer's. And of course, the concern is that this is going to exacerbate his Alzheimer's, and there's some evidence of that. Like, the data that's out there is increasingly damning. The excess deaths are extraordinarily high, but the presumption has to be for every person who dies, there are many more people who are harmed. Cancer, blood clots, that sort of thing. And again, we don't know because it's not being fucking studied. All we know is, well, I'm not going to keep repeating the data that we have. So yeah, it feels like it's a feeling of, I guess, being alone in some ways, or estranged from my family. Yeah. Being afraid for the kids, for my parents. So, yeah, there's a lot of other stuff going on in my life, and this was not what I wanted to share about this week, but this is what's present for me right now. And, yeah, I don't have answers. I don't have conclusions. But I just think there's something very, very, very wrong that this is not being investigated or publicized. That is horrifying. All right. Well, this was week 16. Probably not what either of us expected, but there you go.